Welcome to Hope Stories. Sometimes the most powerful secrets are not hidden in boardrooms or locked safes, but carried quietly inside the hearts of those we least expect. Imagine a moment when a single fall, a single gasp for breath, unravels the perfect illusion of a life built on wealth, loyalty, and love. What would you do if protecting the truth meant destroying everything you've ever trusted, and keeping it meant living with a lie that could shatter lives? This is not just a story of betrayal and power. It is a story of conscience, of a man forced to choose between silence that saves him and truth that might save someone else. The tension grows with every breath, every secret, until one decision changes everything forever. And it all begins on the cold marble floor of a mansion, where nothing is as it seems. The silver tray slipped from Monica Reyes's trembling hands before she even understood what was happening. The sharp crack of porcelain cups shattering against the Italian marble echoed through the cavernous foyer of the Carter estate, a sound so violent it seemed to split the silence of the 10,000-square-foot mansion in half. Hot coffee spilled across a Persian rug worth more than her entire annual salary, seeping into its crimson threads like blood. Monica's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her body curling instinctively around the swell of her 6-month pregnancy, as if shielding the fragile life inside from an invisible blow. Upstairs, Ethan Carter froze mid-sentence in a financial report. For 12 years, he had built an empire brick by brick, closing deals worth millions with nothing but logic, calculation, and the kind of ruthlessness Wall Street applauded. Yet in that instant, every spreadsheet, every contract, every figure on his mahogany desk became irrelevant. He tore down the staircase, his Italian leather shoes striking the steps like gunfire, his tie whipping against his chest. By the time he reached the foyer, the only thing that mattered was the sight of Monica lying pale and breathless, her dark hair fanned out across the marble like spilled ink, her lips parted in a shallow gasp. "Monica," he whispered, dropping to his knees, his $3,000 suit scraping against the stone. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. The pulse was faint, uneven, but still there. Relief flickered through him, followed quickly by an unfamiliar ache, a concern so raw it startled him. He had employed her for 2 years, exchanged nothing more than polite greetings and household instructions. Now her fragility pulled him into a world beyond contracts and profits. His hands, once calloused from construction sites, now steadying themselves on her rounded belly, felt something flutter from within. A small, startling movement, alive and undeniable. Her eyelids fluttered open. Confusion clouded her gaze before it locked on his, and for the first time in her presence, Ethan's expression wasn't composed or detached. It was vulnerable. She tried to sit, her instinct to serve stronger than her own survival, but he held her shoulders gently. "You fainted," he said quietly, his voice softer than he ever used in boardrooms. "You need a doctor." "No." Her cry sliced through the hall, sharp and desperate. She clutched his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Please don't call anyone." The words hung in the air like a threat. Her chest rose and fell, trembling under the weight of a secret too heavy to contain. Tears welled in her eyes, slipping down her face faster than she could wipe them away. Ethan waited, patient but relentless, the way he had learned to wait in negotiations until the silence forced the truth out. Slowly, agonizingly, Monica whispered, "The baby. It's not my husband's." The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. Daniel Reyes, her husband, had stood at the estate gate countless evenings, picking Monica up with a respectful nod. A hard-working man, an honest foreman Ethan had admired from a distance. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he'd misheard. But Monica's tears were too real, her voice too fractured to be a lie. "Then whose child is it?" he asked, his tone steady but his chest pounding. Her lips trembled. The name that left them was heavy, venomous, a name Ethan knew all too well. Richard Donovan. The impact was instant. Ethan staggered back as if struck. Richard, his longtime associate, CEO of Donovan Construction Group, a man with whom he had shaken hands at charity galas and brokered multi-million-dollar deals. Richard, the supposed paragon of success, family man with a wife and 2 teenagers who graced every glossy magazine cover for their philanthropy. Ethan's vision blurred with disbelief. Monica's sobs filled the marble chamber, her hands clutching her swollen stomach, as though the truth itself might tear her apart. She spoke haltingly between sobs about a December night, a company party, the way Richard had offered her a ride when her husband fell ill. How that ride had detoured to a bar, then to a roadside motel. Not once, but again and again in the following weeks, each time while Daniel was away on company trips Richard himself had approved. Her shame was suffocating, but behind it, Ethan saw something else. A pattern, a trap carefully designed by a man who understood power and how to abuse it. Ethan clenched his jaw, fury boiling under his skin. He had fought against predators in business, men who crushed the weak with contracts and capital. But this was different. This was a betrayal of flesh and blood, a calculated violation of trust so profound it made his stomach twist. And now Monica, trembling before him, bore the consequences alone, convinced the world would never believe her over a titan like Richard Donovan. She confessed that the night before, Richard had called her in a panic. His wife, Catherine, had seen her leaving an obstetrician's office. Fear had made him vicious, his voice shaking with threats disguised as reason. "No one will believe you," he'd hissed. "You're just a maid. I have everything to lose. You have nothing." As Ethan absorbed her words, a new silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. He saw not just a terrified woman, but a life about to unravel, and perhaps a chance, a dangerous, impossible chance, to change the balance of power. What would you do if you discovered the person you trusted had built his empire on secrets and lies? Could you stay silent if speaking out meant destroying not just one man, but an entire family's illusion of perfection? The foyer of the Carter estate had witnessed a confession that could burn lives to ashes, and the fire had only just begun to spread. Ethan Carter paced the length of the marble hall, his shoes echoing like thunderclaps in the suffocating silence. He had closed hostile takeovers with steadier hands, faced courtrooms with colder nerves, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the sight of Monica Reyes trembling on his floor, her face pale, her voice raw from crying. Richard Donovan's name still rang in his ears, corrosive and heavy, unraveling every partnership, every shared boardroom victory, every glass of bourbon they had raised in celebration. For years, Ethan had believed Richard to be a man carved from the same stone as himself, ruthless in business perhaps, but anchored by a respectable facade of family, wealth, and influence. Now that facade cracked before his eyes, and the shards cut deeper than he expected. Monica whispered again, broken but deliberate, "He said no one will believe me, that I'm nothing compared to him." Her words pulled Ethan from his spiraling thoughts. He turned back to her and saw the desperation swimming in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of losing her marriage or her livelihood. It was the terror of being erased, of her truth swallowed whole by the power of a man like Donovan. Ethan's chest tightened. He had built an empire on strategy and silence, on knowing when to speak and when to keep secrets. But for the first time in his life, the silence felt like complicity. He crouched beside her again, his voice rougher now. "Monica, you are not nothing, and you're not alone in this." He didn't realize until he said it how dangerous those words were. They weren't just comfort. They were a vow, one that could drag him into a storm that might consume everything he had built. But then Monica's next words cut deeper than any vow could. "I never wanted any of this, Mr. Carter. I wanted a family with Daniel. We tried for years, and I thought this child would heal us. He's so happy talking about names, painting the nursery, and every night I watch him build dreams on a lie I can't take back." Her hands pressed against her stomach, her tears falling onto her uniform. "Every kick I feel reminds me of what I did and who he really belongs to." The confession hit Ethan like a hammer. He had expected shame, even fear. But what he heard was something darker, a woman drowning in guilt so heavy it threatened to crush her before the baby even arrived. He had seen men destroyed by debt, companies gutted by betrayal, but this was more merciless than money. It was a betrayal of the soul. And yet beneath her words, something flickered in him, a realization that her burden had now become his. Because Richard Donovan was not just her secret. He was Ethan's rival, his partner, and in ways Ethan hated to admit, a mirror of the world he himself had chosen to play in. If Donovan could corrupt something as fragile and pure as the hope for a child, what did that make Ethan, who had spent his life trading loyalty for profit, trust for power? He rose abruptly, his heart pounding. The lines between personal and professional had blurred into a fog he couldn't escape. Protect Monica meant betraying Richard, fracturing alliances worth millions, and igniting a war between two empires. Doing nothing meant watching her unravel, condemned to carry a secret that would one day destroy not only her marriage, but perhaps her very sanity. For a man who had always chosen the path of profit, neither option looked like survival. Monica clutched his wrist again, her voice trembling but sharp. "You can't tell Daniel. You can't tell anyone. Promise me." Ethan stared down at her, torn between the promise she begged for and the truth clawing at him. Behind his silence lay an impossible question. Protect her secret or protect her soul? If you were Ethan, would you protect Monica's secret at any cost, or would you risk everything to reveal the truth? The Carter estate now held two lives bound by a secret too explosive to remain hidden, and Ethan knew that whatever he chose next could turn his world into ashes. Follow the next chapter to see which path he dares to take. Ethan Carter had faced enemies in boardrooms, men who would gamble fortunes on the turn of a contract, but the weight pressing down on him now was different. It wasn't about money or empire. It was about a woman crumbling on his marble floor, begging him to keep a secret that could ruin them both. Monica's voice still echoed in his head, trembling with guilt as she confessed that every smile her husband gave her, every word of hope about their unborn child, was built on a lie. Ethan should have felt detached. After all, this wasn't his marriage, his family, his shame. But he couldn't detach. Something about her raw despair had split through the armor he had spent years constructing. She pressed again, her eyes wide, desperate. "Promise me you won't tell him, Mr. Carter. Daniel doesn't deserve this pain. If he finds out, it will kill him." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew Daniel Reyes, a hard-working man with calloused hands and honest eyes, a man who had once told Ethan at the estate gate that he dreamed of saving enough to buy a modest house for his family. That dream was already a graveyard. Daniel just didn't know it yet. The question of whether to protect him or protect Monica's secret wrapped itself around Ethan like a noose. But then Monica whispered something that shifted the ground beneath him. "It wasn't only me he used." Her voice was barely audible, but each word struck like a hammer. Ethan froze. Monica's gaze darted toward the floor as though the marble itself could swallow her shame. "Richard? There are others. I've heard the women on the cleaning staff whisper, girls who worked late, interns at the office, some never came back. They don't talk, but I see it in their faces." Her voice cracked. "I wasn't the first. I won't be the last." Ethan felt a cold fury coil inside him. This wasn't just an affair, a lapse of judgment, or even a one-time betrayal. This was systematic. A man he had trusted in business was not only destroying families, but exploiting lives from the shadows. Ethan's empire had crossed paths with Richard's countless times. Joint projects, financial ventures, high-profile charity galas where they stood shoulder to shoulder for photographs. If Monica was right, every handshake they had shared was stained with silence bought by fear. The moral calculus that had always guided Ethan, profit over sentiment, loyalty over truth, suddenly fractured. Could he still see Richard as just a business partner? Could he allow Donovan's wealth and influence to bury the voices of women like Monica? Yet stepping into this fight meant exposing Monica, destroying her marriage, and potentially unleashing a scandal that could drag down both families and empires. His name, his company, his legacy would be scorched. But the alternative, doing nothing, sickened him in a way he couldn't ignore. Monica looked at him with tear-streaked cheeks, misinterpreting his silence as judgment. "I know what you're thinking, that I brought this on myself, that I should have said no." Ethan's eyes hardened, not with anger at her, but at the man who had made her believe this. He lowered his voice, steady but burning. "Don't ever think this is your fault. Men like Richard don't stumble, they plan. He saw your vulnerability and he exploited it. And if there are others, then he's worse than you imagine." For the first time since her collapse, Monica held his gaze. There was something in his eyes that startled her. Resolve, not pity. Ethan knew this was no longer about one secret. It was about a predator hiding behind power, and about the choice he would have to make. Remain silent and safe, or step into the fire and risk losing everything he had ever built. If you were Ethan, would you sacrifice your empire to bring a man like Richard Donovan down? Or would you stay silent to protect yourself and Monica from destruction? Ethan Carter had just uncovered a rot that reached far deeper than one forbidden pregnancy, and the decision he now faced would determine not only Monica's fate, but the destiny of everyone connected to Richard Donovan's empire. The storm was no longer coming, it was already here. The silence inside the Carter estate grew unbearable, thick as smoke, until Ethan finally broke it with a confession he never intended to make. Monica, I know Richard Donovan isn't the man he pretends to be. I've seen glimpses, deals that reeked of manipulation, investments that left people ruined while his name stayed spotless. I told myself it was business, nothing more. But if what you're saying is true, then this isn't just business. It's something far darker. His words trembled at the edges, not because of doubt, but because he knew they carried the weight of choice. Monica lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes wide with shock. You knew? He nodded slowly. Not about you, not about this, but I knew enough to suspect. And I did nothing. For a man like Ethan Carter, admitting failure was more painful than admitting guilt. He had spent his life believing silence was a form of strength, that not every battle needed to be fought if the cost was too high. But now, faced with the wreckage Richard had left behind, his silence felt like complicity. Monica's lips parted as if to speak, but then she winced, her hand clutching her stomach. Ethan's instincts kicked in and he steadied her, his heartbeat racing. It's fine, she whispered quickly, though her face betrayed pain. The baby, he kicked, harder than usual. Ethan froze at the word he. Until that moment, the child inside her had been a shadow, a secret wrapped in fear and shame. Now it was real, a boy, a life with a name already chosen by a man who loved her without knowing the truth. He thought of Daniel, painting a nursery, dreaming of futures built on a lie, and something inside Ethan cracked. For years he had prided himself on control, on never letting emotion dictate his actions. But the sight of Monica trembling, torn between the man she loved and the predator who had stolen her choices, forced him to confront a truth of his own. He could no longer stand on the sidelines. Yet the moment he resolved to act, another shadow fell over him. If he moved against Richard Donovan, he would ignite a war not only in business, but in blood. Richard had enough influence to bury Monica's story, destroy Ethan's empire, and smear their names until no one cared about the truth. And Ethan knew something else, something he had buried deep. Richard Donovan once saved him. Years earlier, when Ethan's company faced collapse from a government investigation, it had been Richard who slipped him information, evidence that turned the tide and saved his empire. Ethan had told himself it was loyalty between businessmen, a calculated favor to protect shared investments. But now, in the harsh light of Monica's confession, that old debt felt like a chain around his neck. Could he destroy the man who had once rescued him, even knowing the monster Richard had become? Monica's hand clutched his sleeve again, her voice small but piercing. Please, Mr. Carter, if you speak out, you lose everything. If you stay silent, I lose myself. What would you choose? Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in years, he didn't know. He felt as though the marble beneath them was crumbling, the empire he built teetering above an abyss. Silence would preserve his world. Truth would burn it down. Both choices demanded a sacrifice he wasn't sure he had the strength to make. If you were in Ethan's place, would you betray the man who once saved your life to protect Monica and expose the truth? Or would you protect your empire and live with the weight of silence? As Monica's confession collided with Ethan's hidden debt to Richard Donovan, the lines between loyalty, justice, and survival blurred, and the decision he would make next threatened to destroy them all. The weight of the past pressed harder than the silence in the Carter estate. Ethan had buried that memory for years. The late-night call, The folder of documents slid discreetly across a mahogany bar table. Richard Donovan's voice low but steady as he said, "This will save you, but one day you'll remember who gave it to you." Ethan had never asked where Richard got the evidence that dismantled the investigation, threatening to dismantle Carter Development. He hadn't wanted to know. All he cared about was survival, and Richard gave it to him. That night had rewritten his future. Without Richard, there would be no Carter Empire, no mansion, no seat at the table of power. And now, standing over Monica Reyes, Ethan realized his empire might have been built on a favor poisoned from the start. Monica's breathing slowed as she leaned back against the wall, exhaustion softening her frame. Her words still echoed. "If you speak out, you lose everything. If you stay silent, I lose myself." Ethan couldn't shake the conflict. For years he had believed in a brutal but simple truth. Everyone carried secrets, and survival belonged to those who kept theirs buried the longest. But this was no longer about him. Richard hadn't simply betrayed a woman's trust. He had twisted vulnerability into a weapon, and if Monica was right, he had done it again and again. The image of Daniel Reyes flashed in Ethan's mind. An honest man, building a life piece by piece, oblivious to the rot beneath his feet. Ethan felt sick because for the first time he saw himself not as different from Richard, but dangerously close. Silence had saved his empire once. What if silence now meant he was no better than the predator who had created this nightmare? As Ethan wrestled with the memory, Monica suddenly reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. She handed it to him wordlessly. On the screen was a string of messages from an unknown number. Ethan scrolled, his pulse hammering. The words were unmistakably Richard's. Veiled threats, desperate pleas, promises that if she kept quiet, she'd be taken care of. And then one message sent just hours earlier made Ethan's blood run cold. If Catherine suspects, if Daniel suspects, this all falls apart. You know what happens then. You'll regret opening your mouth. Ethan gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just intimidation. It was the language of a man cornered, a man prepared to destroy anyone who endangered his facade. Suddenly, Ethan realized the true danger wasn't just Richard's power, it was his fear. A desperate man with resources could be far more dangerous than one in control. He could silence Monica permanently if he believed she posed a threat. He handed the phone back to her, his voice taut with urgency. "You can't be alone with this. He's watching you, maybe even now. If he feels you might expose him, he won't hesitate." Monica's eyes widened, her hand instinctively shielding her stomach. "What are you saying?" Ethan exhaled slowly, each word costing him. "I'm saying that protecting you may mean going against him directly. And when I do, he'll come for both of us." The admission shocked even him. For the first time, he wasn't calculating percentages or weighing profits. He was making a choice that could burn his empire to ashes. But there was something raw and unshakable inside him now, something he couldn't ignore. He had once owed Richard his life's work. Now he owed Monica the truth. If you were Ethan, would you risk provoking a powerful man like Richard Donovan to protect Monica and her unborn child? Or would you walk away before the storm consumed you too? The past debt Ethan owed had just collided with the present danger, and the price of silence or truth was no longer measured in money, but in lives. The next move would change everything. Ethan Carter stood in the quiet of his own estate, the weight of the choice pressing against his chest like a stone. The marble floors beneath his feet, once symbols of everything he had earned, now felt cold, soulless, like monuments to silence. Monica Reyes sat near the wide window, one hand resting protectively on her stomach, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the world beyond the glass. Outside, the autumn leaves fell in slow spirals, golden and red, like time unraveling itself. She had entrusted him with the truth, and with that truth came a debt greater than the one he owed Richard Donovan. For days, Ethan wrestled with it, torn between the empire Richard once helped him preserve and the lives Richard continued to destroy. He met Donovan twice in those days, face to face. The first time at a charity gala where Richard smiled for the cameras, Catherine Donovan at his side, their children flanking them like a portrait of perfection. Ethan shook his hand, the weight of Monica's confession burning in his mind. and for a moment he wanted to rip away the mask, but he said nothing. Silence tasted like ash. The second time was different. They sat across from one another in a private office, the city lights flickering outside. Richard leaned back, the same easy confidence he had always worn, but there was fear in his eyes now, hidden behind rehearsed charm. "You don't want to cross me, Ethan. You know better than anyone. You owe me." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but unshakable. "I don't owe you anymore. That debt was paid the moment you decided to use power to ruin lives. Whatever we were, it ends here." Richard's smirk faltered, but his voice stayed cold. "If you burn me, you burn too." Ethan didn't flinch. "Then let it burn." What followed was not swift. It was war. Rumors spread, stories whispered in boardrooms and corridors. Ethan moved quietly, gathering testimonies from those Richard had silenced, women who had been too afraid to speak until now. Some trembled when they saw the headlines break months later. Others wept with relief. Monica never spoke publicly. Her name was never in the papers. But Ethan's fingerprints were everywhere in the storm that brought Richard Donovan's empire crashing down. Lawsuits piled like mountains, investors fled, and the man who had once walked untouchable through glass towers now stumbled in shadows, his face on every screen, his legacy reduced to disgrace. But victories like this are never clean. Ethan's company bled too. Investors whispered his name in the same breath as Donovan's. Partnerships crumbled, and the empire he had fought to build was cut down to half its former glory. In the quiet after the storm, Ethan realized the truth. Sometimes survival is not the same as winning. Sometimes justice demands a cost that cannot be reclaimed. Daniel Reyes never knew. To him, Monica's fainting that September morning was nothing more than exhaustion from pregnancy. When their son was born in the winter, Daniel held him in his arms with tears of joy, naming him Gabriel as though the child were a gift from heaven. Monica smiled through her own tears, a smile that broke Ethan's heart when he visited the hospital room. She would carry the truth alone, her penance carved into silence, but her son's cries filled the sterile halls with a new kind of life. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching the family he had helped protect, and for once he didn't feel like a savior or a businessman. He felt human. When Daniel looked up, gratitude in his eyes, Ethan nodded once and left without a word. He didn't need thanks. The empire was smaller now, his reputation scarred, but Ethan had made his choice. He had broken the silence. He had turned debt into redemption, and though the cost was heavy, the sight of Monica holding her child was proof enough that some losses are worth bearing. On a quiet night weeks later, Ethan sat alone in his office, the city's hum outside his window. A single photograph lay on his desk. Richard Donovan, smiling at a gala years ago, his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan stared at it for a long time before slipping it into a drawer and locking it away. Some ghosts never leave, but they no longer define the living. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, felt the weight on his chest ease. What did you feel while reading this story? And how would you describe the ending in your own words? If you like this story, comment 100 below. From which country are you watching this? Share this story with your friends, and thank you for watching Hope Stories.